Okay, so today we're going to talk about cross-device experiences and try to get insight about making them more fluid. So Microsoft has this line of Surface devices, right? The Studio, the Pro, the Go, the Hub. And basically we have that vision of people working together, on this desk, across multiple devices, multiple people. In fact, the reality is quite different from this. In fact, if you look at this just one person, they already have a number of devices that they work with. And then you see, I think technical term for this is messy. You have multiple devices. You have your mobile phone. You have maybe a tablet. You have your laptop. You bring it from home. Then if you add other people to the mix, it's even worse, right? But you also have, a lot of material that's actually paper. You have printed reference material. You have loose paper and notebooks where you take notes on. So basically, it's, from that study, even from 2013, but even nowadays, it's probably even worse that you still have sort of a messy environment. And if you look beyond the actual physical objects, the ecology of software that's out there to enable you to share files and work on them is also sort of messy. If you see that study, they were actually looking at how people share the file with collaborators by email, but they keep a version on their laptop, and then they have another version unsynchronized from their desktop. So really, when you're working with other people and even with just yourself on multiple files, the whole process is sort of not fluid. And so my recent interest is to really look at the knowledge worker workflow. And by knowledge worker, I mean people who are using Word, Excel, and a word like Office products, and then really trying to understand what they're doing across all of those products and all of those devices. And now a simple observation is that a lot of the files that people create on multiple devices or just multiple apps actually contain different pieces of information that one needs to sort of put together, cross-reference, and relate in order to provide evidence for decision-making, for example, or to put together a talk like I did today. So they need to sort of de-silo that information is in a separate file. And some of our work investigated how we can reintegrate the ink and the digital pen in that process. And I'm just going to show you a sneak peek video, so just to make a little bit of cool factor to the beginning of that session. Our latest work that looked at basically how we can relate different sources of information. So here, imagine I've annotated a document that's based on several data sources. And I've used my digital ink there. And so what's cool about the digital versus the analog one is if I just interact with it, I can basically relate the source of that information that is related to my document. So here, I'm bringing back, for example, the Excel data spreadsheet. And this basically can extend beyond the multiple apps, right? It naturally goes with different sources of information coming from different devices or different people. So for example, I have a couple of files on my Surface Pro, but then I have also information that I want to relate from my meeting on the Surface Hub with my team. And here we started looking at different cross-device interactions, such as underlining a piece of information, like while relaxing on the sofa on my Go, and then later retrieving that piece of information on a larger surface at work. So for example, here, by searching shapes that you can bookmark information with, I can retrieve, say, a chart I've seen in Excel, a paragraph that I had in Word, and then that line that I did underline on my Surface Go in my email. And so I have this larger set of device to this larger device to sort of interact and think with my data. So we're sort of at a crossroad here. We started just investigated sort of this workflow of knowledge worker, but we don't really have enough information about what to do across device to make this really fluid. And this is actually the goal of that panel today is to get the perspective from experts in the field, the master of the cross-device experiences. And we are so lucky to have 4 of them today, and each will give a unique insight in some of the possibilities to enable those fluid cross-device experiences. And so our first speaker today is Saul Greenberg from University of Calgary. Welcome, Saul. So Saul is a faculty professor and emeritus professor in the Department of Computer Science at University of Calgary. His work is at the intersection of HCI, CSCW, collaborative, well, I can never know this one. Collaborative work, and ubiquitous computing. He has so many papers and awards. I will just say that you're lucky to hear him today give us insight about this cross-device experiences.
Sure, thanks. Before you go, can you just take that?
Sure.
Okay, thanks. What you just saw me giving her was a piece of paper that was extremely lightweight, extremely easy. And essentially, that was a cross-device experience where I transferred information from my hands to her hands, and the devices was her hands. So what I'm going to talk about today is essentially how can we use social science, our natural act, to design fluid cross-device experiences. So a big challenge in interaction design is how to fluidly transfer content across devices. For example, from tablets to large displays, or between tablets held by the same or different people, or in fact between any of the devices we now carry or have in the world around us. So the message I wanted to deliver is that social science theory can inform or inspire the design of socially natural, fluid cross-device experiences. That is, I'm going to advocate a socially centric versus a technology-centric approach to design. So let's start by considering a small space ecology, just as similar to what Natalie showed before. So Ubicom sees people with an ecology of devices, phones, tablets, large displays, and other appliances. And the problem is that it's incredibly awkward and difficult to interconnect these devices, let alone interact and transfer content between them in a cohesive manner. So just think back to the last time you tried to share a photo with a friend and how awkward it could be. I know that for my purposes, I often end up using email or Dropbox or some other mechanism with an iPhone to try to do it. And it's doable, but it's painful. So I want you to imagine a new kind of ubiquitous computing environment where there's an ecology of devices that react to people's social expectations in a way that facilitates natural social practice. That is, the devices become social actors. So what I'm really talking about is exploiting social sciences as a method to inspire the design of interactive systems. So to do this, I'm going to begin with a first fairly old but simple social science theory where we take advantage of people's natural expectations of spatial relations, and that's called proxemics. So in the 1960s, an anthropologist, Edward Hall, defined the notion of proxemics. That is, how people manage their interpersonal space. And his basic theory is very simple. It correlates physical distance to social distance. Now, this is something we all know tacitly, especially when it's violated. So here's some images. Past President Lyndon Johnson was known for his domineering personalities. And in what became known as the Johnson treatment, he would intentionally penetrate people's personal space, as seen in the series of photos of him interacting with the senator. It was said that his treatment was rude, bullying, improper, annoying, but effective. That is, he used his knowledge of proxemics as a power relationship. Now, more formally, and perhaps more naturally, Edward Hall described a series of zones around people. So starting from the inside, we have the intimate zone, and characterized by those 2 levers in the upper corner over there. Moving out a bit, we have the personal zone. That's where close friends and colleagues are situated relative to one another as they converse. Again, as shown by that wonderful statue up in the corner that you're looking at. Somewhat outside is the social zone, and that's where acquaintances usually sit. So that photo that you see there shows this really well. The 2 girls and 2 guys are in each other's personal zone, but the girls and guys are separated in their social zones. That shows a bit of distance between them. And finally, we have the public zone reserved for things like strangers occupying a space where people tend to separate themselves by distance when they can. And we can even see that in this room here. Some people, like where you see friends together, but you also see people finding their own space. Now, there are, of course, many other attributes that come into play when interpreting proxemic cues. And one of them is called gradual engagement. And that's how we signal how people become aware and gradually move toward each other to engage in interaction. So gradual engagement begins with mutual awareness of each other's presence, a greetings to acknowledge that presence, an approach, and interaction, usually in that social zone or intimate zone, and then a disengagement. People's orientation to one another can also signal social engagement or disengagement, which is clearly visible in those two contrasting photos. Same distance, different level of involvement. Identity helps define past relationships and interpret current relationships, and that needs to be considered as well. There's also environmental features. For example, the fixed features of a space that communicate territories or boundaries, like rooms, doorways, signals different distances. For example, a person outside a doorway is seen as more distance than a person inside a doorway. The environment can also contain semi-fixed features that can be configured to encourage or discourage interactivity. For example, this seating encourages small group activity, whereas changing it to this seating arrangement somewhat discourages it. Context is also critical for interpreting proxemic cues, as shown here by contrasting a home versus a crowded subway setting. But in spite of all this, we can still consider proximity and a few other attributes as a reasonable first approximation of social engagement. Now, let's now see how we can use proxemics to inspire design. Or I'm going to show you how I and a whole bunch of other colleagues, some who are on this panel, use these theories to inform and inspire the design of cross-device experiences. Now, the basic idea is that both people and the devices they carry are considered social actors, each obeying the rules of proxemics. So, as computer scientists, the first question we had to answer was how to operationalize proxemics as metrics we could capture from our environment. And the result was 5 dimensions between people and their devices. We can capture the distance between them, their relative orientation, their movement toward or away from each other, their identity, and also contextual information about the location. And without getting into details of how these were captured by our technology, the examples that follow sense some or all of these metrics to enable social rules that drive cross-device interaction. So our first test bed, which is now fairly old, was a proxemic media player which recognizes the proxemic relations between a person, a handheld media player that they carry that contained content, and a large display. Let's take a look.
We illustrate this using a media sharing functionality between a portable digital media device and the large surface. The system provides awareness information regarding sharing possibilities while the device is at a distance. An icon representing the portable device on the large screen changes its position and size depending on the orientation and distance of the portable device to the screen. Full access and information exchange is possible once the person brings the device close to the screen.
So what we saw in that clip was not only the use of proximity, but a design pattern based on that notion of gradual engagement I mentioned earlier. That is, as a person and as their device gets closer to each other, it signals the awareness of the device presence and a connectivity in the social zone, the reveal of exchangeable content in the personal zone, and then it offers interaction methods to transfer content tuned to each zone. So let's take a look at a somewhat similar example that explicitly shows these stages of gradual engagement, because it's important that you see them to understand how that works.
When a person enters the room, an icon on the large display indicates the camera's presence. As the person moves closer to the display, the images stored on the camera are progressively revealed. A tilt gesture allows for scrolling through the images. These images then can be copied to the display using direct touch.
So those examples show one person doing cross-device interaction. So let's now see how this applies to two or more people exchanging content between their handheld devices and also through a public display. Oops, let me just get this here.
When a person enters the room, an icon...
Sorry. Oh, I'm doing some... here we go. Okay, so this should start. So here, people maintain awareness of surrounding devices by icons that move to show their relative location. And this helps in a cluttered environment to find out what they can interact with. The same icon serves as portals for a technique called collaborative handoff. So here, one person offers content by dragging it onto the portal, and the other person accepts it by dragging it off the portal. And that's very similar to the physical act of giving and taking, and offers a degree of security as one person offers to the other and then takes it. Here's another example where those rectangles show a person's content on their personal device, and here they're dragging it onto the public display, which serves as the intermediary, and the other person accepts it by dragging it into their own display. Now, proxemics is just one social theory involving people's spatial relationships, but there are other related social theories that we can use to tune that interaction even further. So I'm going to introduce you to two other theories very briefly called F-formations and micromobility. So take a look at this photo, and quickly, what do you see? Well, you'll likely see three groups. All are not only defined by proxemics, but by the way the groups orient themselves and create a shared space between them. And that's what the social theory called F-formations is all about. So a typical F-formation arrangement is a roughly circular cluster of several people. The inner space of that circle was called the overlap space, and that's reserved for the main activity the group is pursuing. So it's kind of like their shared working area. The ring of space occupied by the people is the participant space, and that determines group membership. And this is where people stand. The surrounding region buffers the group from the outside world. So people who are nearby but not in the participant space are excluded from the social circle, but still monitored to see who may be trying to join. Now, a second social theory is much more fine-grained. I'll just briefly mention it now, and it's called micromobility. That is, how people manipulate items in that overlap space to indicate the degree that those items are shared, owned, and handed off to one another. For example, take a look at this doctor with a medical chart and the way they're holding it. Here, it's clear that that chart is owned by them and that they're looking at it as not for the patient. And yet, a slight change in the angle of that chart indicates an intent to share that information with that other person. And of course, an even further movement of that chart toward the person signals that it's an offer to them to take it. So let's briefly consider how all this fits together for cross-device experiences. We can use proxemics to detect social engagement. We detect F-formations to define groups and to create federations between the devices they carry, excluding those outside the F-formations to safeguard privacy and security. And we can monitor device micromobility to define appropriate cross-device interaction within that F-formation. So here's an early example illustrating how F-formations and micromobility can be applied to design interaction techniques for subtle cross-device content transfer. And that was done by our next, one of our speakers, Nick, when he was interning with Ken at Microsoft.
In co-present collaborative activities, people often orient themselves in specific spatial arrangements that facilitate communication, so-called F-formations. Examples of these formations are people standing side by side, corner to corner, or face to face when interacting with another. Our system monitors people's distance and orientation relative to each other around them and observes any formations between them. The system then leverages the knowledge about people's formations to allow people to easily share information to a person standing next to them, whereas a person standing at the same distance but facing away from the formation is excluded from the lightweight federation of devices. We developed 4 interaction techniques allowing people to share information while standing next to each other in a formation. First, the tilt to preview technique shows a temporary copy of the touched item when a person tilts their tablet towards the second person. Touching the item on the other tablet lets the second person keep a permanent copy. Second, our face-to-mirror technique lets a person mirror the currently largest item on their screen to the other person's tablet when holding it vertically. Again, touching the item keeps a permanent copy. Third, colored edges appear when a person tilts their tablet towards another person. Dragging an item onto these edges, so-called portals, moves it to the other person's tablet. Fourth, with the cross-device pinch-to-zoom technique, people can view any item on the combined viewing area of multiple tablets.
So what's key to all those is that to try to get the socially natural experience, we have to detect that information, and it's enacted only on the devices that are part of that federation, and it obeys the rules of micromobility. So that's a preview. So in closing, this talk was all about advocating social science theory as a way to inform the design of socially natural cross-device experiences. And I hope that becomes part of our discussion. But I also believe that discussion should concern dark patterns. As researchers, we design with our white hats on for the good to improve human experiences. The problem is that we should also expect black hat designs based on proxemic interactions that don't have the user's best interest in mind. So we identified some of these, and just to kind of give you an example of a black hat thing, here's a video of an existing system which embraces a pattern called the attention grabber, which tries to take over a person's device to attract their attention.
When Phoebe enters a participating store, her phone instantly recognizes the in-store shop beacon signal. And because she's opted in, it reminds her to open the Shopkick app and get walk-in reward kicks. It also shows her how many items she's liked at that store. While Phoebe shops, the Shopkick app can tell her about special offers and deals. And the app can even remind her of the items she's liked in departments she visits.
So I'll just let you decide if that part of the future you want. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So here, I took good care of it. So thank you so much. Do we have a question for Saul? We'll have a lot of discussion perhaps at the end with all of our speakers, but if we have like a particular question on that topic, I'd like to take it now.
There's one over there.
Wait, there's a...
Hi, Lucy Fortson, University of Minnesota. So what are the issues around social norms and the social theories that would underlie all of this? So I understand that, I think that's a sufficient question.
Yeah, so it's interesting that the person who first talked about proxemics theory was an anthropologist, and his actual research was about what differences in how different cultures used proxemic cues. In some cultures, the distance meant very different things. So I completely agree. If what you're really asking, in a sense, is there one measure that we can use for everyone? And the answer is unlikely. On the other hand, what we are talking about is not a strict requirement that we exactly obey the rules of our social norms. We're talking about using this to inspire design. So I think we can relax that quite a bit as long as it's very clear as what our technology is trying to do. So there's a balance point in there. Devices aren't people. And I think people will accept that and will relax their expectations somewhat. And that's probably it for now.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Saul. See you soon. All right. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Nikolai Marquardt, with a D and a T, and all of the other letters. He's an associate professor in physical computing at the University College London. His research is really cross-disciplinary. He's done physical user interfaces. He's done cross-device interaction, ubiquitous computing. He's also a master sketcher, and he does beautiful sketch noting of your talks. One of his actually book on like sketching user experience, I think you are on that book too, Bill. Maybe you should check out. It's about sketching for HCI. And he has also numerous publications and awards. And I'm so happy that you're here, Nick, today.
Thank you very much for the kind.
Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here with you today and telling you a bit more about our work in cross-device interactions. Now, as we've seen with the many examples shown in Saul's talk, the field of cross-device computing is investigating how we can move beyond interaction with a single device and instead design for interactions that span across the larger ecology of devices and people. And the goal is technology that works in concert to best support the task at hand. Now, much work has been done on designing and studying cross-device interactions, mostly in the past 10 to 15 years, leading to a disconnected terminology and techniques, creating an overall fragmented research landscape. And with a goal to unify some part of that large space of techniques and systems, and to inform future research, we worked on creating a taxonomy of cross-device interactions. For this, we analyzed over 500 papers in the cross-device interaction domain to synthesize techniques, strategies, and common patterns. And the photo here shows how our attempt looked like when we tried to nicely organize our findings across any available space in our office. Now, what I'm planning to do now over the next 15 minutes is that I would like to unpack this taxonomy a little bit to give you an overview of the research space. In particular, out of our analysis of terminology, applications, system, evaluations, and techniques, I want to guide you through 3 specific parts of our taxonomy. And with this, I would like to answer and give answers and address 3 particular questions. First, what does the field of cross-device interaction look like? Second, what are techniques we can use for designing fluid cross-device interactions? And third, I'd like to give you a few pointers of open issues and opportunities of where we can go next. Now, this work, the taxonomy, and the many examples I'll show you in the next 15 minutes have been work that were done with a whole number of collaborators. In particular, many parts that you see today are based on the work of my PG student, Frederick Broody. So let me start with the overview of the field. The work we sampled in our taxonomy covered people's interactions across a wide spectrum of different technology, from laptops, phones, tablets, all the way to large interactive surfaces, tangibles, and augmented or virtual reality. And not surprisingly, the terminology used was quite diverse. We tried to untangle this in the visual summary you can see here, and the main takeaways here are that cross-device interactions range across a broad spectrum of device form factors, and that besides the more traditional screen-based devices, the research increasingly includes categories such as tangibles, wearables, and AR/VR headsets. Now, second is that the diverse terms that are used then, such as multi-device, cross-surface, distributed, or multi-mobile interaction, often outline and target specific focused areas. But let us have a closer look at the characteristics of those interactions. Now, in our main taxonomy overview, we identified a number of categories of cross-device configurations, from mirrored to distributed user interfaces, all the way to migratory and cross-platform interfaces. And I'll explain a few of them shortly. They fall into 2 main categories. Interactions can either be synchronous, when interactions happen at the same time, or asynchronous, with a sequential flow of interactions across devices. And the large majority of the work we sampled in our survey falls into the first synchronous category. Besides the temporal and configuration characteristics, there are 4 more dimensions that we can see here at the bottom. The relationship of people and devices, and Saul mentioned many examples that address that category in particular, the scale they interact on, the dynamics of the setup, and lastly, the use of space. This diagram represents our key synthesis of the disparate but interwoven threads of the research field. And I'll have to admit it's a bit of a complicated diagram. So let me show you some examples across that taxonomy. First, we have distributed user interfaces, which can either be spatially or logically distributed. Spatial distribution means that the area of one device continues and extends to other devices. And the video here shows a simple example with a geographical map that spans across a number of tablets. Our taxonomy then points to a number of relevant techniques for spatial distribution, such as annexing, stitching, or perspective-aware interfaces. As the second category of distributed interfaces, we have logical distribution on the right, which describes how user interfaces or elements are logically distributed across multiple devices. And related techniques here are the seamless or continuous UIs, multiple coordinated views, and interface beaming. And most of the examples we've seen in Saul's presentation fit into that category over here. Now here's another example of recent work that we did. We built a platform for flexible ad hoc cross-device setups called Surface Constellation. And this cross-device project falls into the category of logical distribution and also matches to several of the categories across the taxonomy overview you can see here. So we were interested in exploring how a person could easily create ad hoc multi-device workspaces essentially by combining a stack of tablet devices in front of them in new ways. So our system provided a hardware and software platform that facilitates the creation of such multi-tablet workspaces. And let me show you just two examples of what those were. So first here, users setting up a 3-tablet visual analytics workstation. And instead of just putting them flat in front of them, the platform allows to dynamically put them together in the workspace in front of them, and also adding devices ad hoc to the setup. In this example you've seen here is where the phone is added as a control interface, controlling some of the information that are seen on the tablets. Another example is a multi-user gaming setup. And in this device assembly, a person puts the tablets together so that the shared tablet in the center shows the playing field, while the user-facing devices show the private view of each user's ladders. And then each player can easily access their own and the shared playing board just because of that particular configuration. So let's go back to our taxonomy. There's a last category in this diagram I would like to point out, and that are migratory interfaces. This is about adaptive interfaces that are capable of migrating between multiple devices, which are often of different form factors. And related techniques here are continuity, component migration, and other model-based approaches. And in her talk later, Caroline will actually explain a few of the novel techniques to address interaction challenges in that particular space. Now, overall, this taxonomy synthesizes key characteristics of the field of cross-device interaction. And our hope is that it can help to outline the scope and pathways through the different characteristics of future projects in this area. Now, after we now had a look at the overall research field, I would like to now guide you through an overview of interaction techniques for fluid cross-device interactions. Now, Saul mentioned earlier that a major challenge is how we can transfer content between devices in fluid interactions. And across all the interaction techniques we looked at, we identified 3 key phases that those interaction techniques are usually part of. First, the configuration phase. Second, the content engagement phase. And third, the disengagement phase, which essentially is about disconnecting cross-device setups or ending an interaction or application. Now, across all those phases, we mapped out the interaction techniques we found in the literature using a number of input modalities, such as touch, gestures, and device manipulation. Let's have a closer look at the configuration phase, which addresses issues such as setting up, pairing, or connecting devices. Now, for example, proxemic interaction that Saul mentioned earlier are part of the input modality body gestures. And the category is essentially about leveraging knowledge about a person's presence, turning, or approach to initiate interactions or offering interactions between people's devices. Here's another example where input modality device motion includes Ken's work of synchronous gestures and related approaches where key sensing events can initiate pairing of devices. Now we can now move to the second phase, the content engagement phase, which contains techniques that are aimed at interacting or transferring content or in other ways exploring data. For example, a large body of prior work has looked at how to transfer content between devices, for example, through dragging, pick and drop, swiping, flicking, or other gestures. Here's an example and a technique from our previous work. I showed you this video in the beginning of my talk where a person can simply use flicking touch gestures to transfer information across a number of devices in front of them. And to make this interaction technique work, we had to build a system that senses the accurate position and orientation of all those devices over there, and that creates a lot of challenges that I'll come back to just at the end of my talk. Now, instead of using touch gestures, we can go to another input modality and actually use freehand gestures around the device. And we build a simple example to illustrate that technique where a person here can hover with their hand above the tablets. They can pick up objects and move them across the screens of those multiple tablets in front of them. Now, of course, systems and techniques don't have to strictly fall into one of those categories over here. And in fact, I would argue that some of the most powerful techniques are hybrids involving multiple input modalities. And an example of this was the gradual engagement pattern that Saul mentioned earlier, which spans across a number of those different input modalities. This overview of interaction techniques can also help us to identify where there are gaps in prior research. And for example, we found that there are not many techniques that cover the disengagement phase. And this third phase is concerned with interaction techniques for a person to stop cross-device content engagement and on a device, on infrastructure or application level implemented for those techniques. And I think that for any real-world deployments of cross-device interaction techniques, it will be critical for us to find appropriate techniques in this phase. Now I'll stop here with my summary of interaction techniques. There are a number of other categories on taxonomy that you might be interested in, covering visualization techniques, tracking technology, evaluation, and application domains, but I'll not go into more details of those. And instead, I would like to now have a closer look at number 3 here, at the techniques for cross-device interaction. I would close with the question of what are the open issues and where can we go next? Now, we synthesized 9 key themes and challenges and opportunities in our taxonomy. And due to time constraints, I'll only focus on 3 of those. First, how do we tell people what they can do with their devices and how to do it? And that's a relatively general problem in HCI for sure. So while cross-device capabilities in recent years started to appear in commercial products, studies have shown controversial findings about their use. And for example, studies with continuity showed that users have challenges in understanding its features. They're also not aware of its presence and effects, and they're also unclear about how to mitigate the significant privacy issues when devices are shared. And the underlying challenge here is in communicating the action possibilities and benefits of cross-device interaction in systems and applications. And more specifically, I would argue that we do need new concepts, feedback, and possibly also feed-forward mechanism, as well as user interface patterns that are designed specifically for cross-device computing. Second, designing new cross-device systems involves tackling challenges of social relations and norms, privacy, authentication, as well as providing support for the configuration work needed in the engagement and disengagement phase I showed you earlier. Our analysis found that lack of interaction techniques in the disengaging phase from cross-device interactions in particular, but users need the ability to configure and reconfigure cross-device functionality, and interactive systems need to explicitly support opting in and opting out mechanisms. And as shown earlier in Saul's talk, the notions of proximity and proxemics, micromobility, and other nuances of social context can be leveraged when designing cross-device systems. Third, much of the enabling technology for cross-device interactions in our research space of HCI is prototypical, difficult to set up, expensive, and requires a lot of space. And on a technical level, cross-device research needs more practical testing and refinement for situations outside of the research lab to deploy wider scale use and for in the wild deployments. And here are just a few examples of our relatively complex tracking infrastructures that were needed for the examples I showed you earlier. And there's an interesting opportunity to design specialized inside-out tracking approaches, devices that are aware of only some of the nuances of the context around them. These are the steps towards real-world deployment of cross-device work, robust, mobile, and supporting ad hoc situations. And researchers in academia and industry have begun to point out and tackle this infrastructure problem, but only few efforts have focused on minimizing setup and configuration time on the user's part of enabling interactions out of the box. Now, with this, I would like to end our journey through the cross-device interaction space and our taxonomy in particular. And my goal was to give you an overview of the field, to provide a synthesis of some of the techniques allowing fluid cross-device interactions, and to summarize a few issues and opportunities. My hope is that some of the characteristics and techniques I briefly mentioned here can inspire future work of interactions across devices, and also look forward to some discussions, either as part of this panel or in the remaining time of the faculty summit over here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nick. So we have time for perhaps one question, and then we defer lots of the discussion at the end. Is there one question about this? Nope. So let's move on, and we'll revisit.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. All right, I'll come to our next speaker. Maybe we should say thank you, though. Our next speaker, so what's your name again? Oh, so this is Ken Hinckley, actually happens to be my manager, the founder of our group, EPIC. He's been at Microsoft Research since 1997. is the master of pen and touch and context sensing. He's done so many publications. I just still need to catch up and read them all. And I invite you to do so. And he's going to share some of his insight today with us about cross-device interaction.
All right, thanks, Natalie. Indeed, I am Ken, and I'm thrilled to have you all here on our campus today. So I'd like to share with you a few thoughts on how we can take a practical approach to sensing across both devices and contexts. My hope is to put some of these social theory motivated concepts that Saul talked about into action in a compelling way that real people can use without having to sense everything. But I want to be clear at the outset here that I don't have all the answers. So I'm going to draw on a few examples from our research, but this is also an area where we have some new work in progress. So let me start by hearkening back to one of the great examples that Saul's group explored. These totally succeeded in showing the importance of social theory concepts like proxemics. But technically, the system collects a great deal of information. There's markers on every device, and there's all these special cameras that are kind of hidden all over to track everything. So it's not at all clear how to take this further out into the wilderness of the real world. Or to take this whole infrastructure that Nick and I built together. It enables some really neat stuff, but the second you walked outside these little orange boxes on the carpet, never mind outside the lab, never mind in the wild, all the magic of the system completely fizzled. So if we want real and practical device ecologies, we have to ask, what can we do with much more limited but still nuanced notions of context? Or to say it another way, how far can just a bit of sensing get us? And I think there's room for great creativity in this direction. So my main message is that practical approaches that combine interaction design with nuanced but incomplete sensing have great promise. It's nuanced because, as we'll show, we can sense some interesting subtleties. But it's incomplete because we don't try or even aspire to sense everything. In the limit, that has the potential to be harmful. We want practical systems that leave people in control while hopefully avoiding some of the types of dark patterns that Saul alluded to that might be enabled by more ubiquitous tracking infrastructures. And for all these reasons, micromobility and how it can scaffold proxemic interactions is of particular interest to me. But first, you sort of have to pay attention here to what I call the seen but unnoticed. Let's circle back to this example from Saul and take a closer look, this time at the woman in the center in particular. So notice how her possessions reinforce a proxemic message of distance. Her bag's protecting her like a shield. She's got sunglasses in case there's any doubt of that message. And even the book she holds kind of forms this little intimate cocoon close to her person. So that's a very subtle example of micromobility in everyday life. In this case, it's an unmistakable cue of don't bother me. And it's manifest in the objects she holds and places around her person. Let's take another quick example that actually came from some of the studies that Nick and I did back when he was here as an intern far too long ago. He's making me feel old here. And this hints even more strongly at how much we might do with lightweight sensing of certain cues. So in this example, two people are having a discussion, and the guy in sort of the beige polo shirt is showing some information. But now the guy in the black jacket decides he has a point he wants to make, and so he starts just raising his device very subtly before he even begins speaking, while this other person is still making their point. And then all he does is pick up his device, and then instantly the other guy kind of puts his surface down. So these are very lightweight and subtle cues to grab attention in the conversation, but it can be totally effective. And this is how people use these sort of micromobility cues in the physical objects they hold, and furthermore, nuances of how they hold, move, angle, and grip devices to communicate non-verbally. So let's go into a few examples here. All right, and I want to start really simple. This is like a little unpublished project we have. It was done in collaboration with Caroline's student Hugo Romat and also Professor Christopher Collins. So Microsoft Surface Studio, you may have seen it. It's essentially this little mini drafting table, and you can adjust it and it holds this angle. They're really nice to work with. But it only gives you a single degree of freedom of movement. But what if you could sense even just that, this very limited form of micromobility? What could you do with that?
In flat mode, the user can create personal information such as sticky notes. Tilting the surface up hides personal content. The user can create content and annotate it in OneNote. Tilting the surface up transforms this annotated content into a presentation. We have prototyped interaction techniques for both discrete and continuous layers, which take advantage of the unique tilting capabilities of the Surface devices, providing functions which are natural and ergonomically appropriate to each of the tilt angles.
All right, so you can see it's very simple. There's no major miracles required to pull this off. And we could weave these kind of micromobility-inspired interactions into everyday digital activity in our collaborations. Let me go into one other example here. This is work that was led by Dongwook Yoon about 5 years ago, where we went just a bit further with the sensing and tried to include some details of the hand grasp that can add further nuances to device micromobility. And there's ideas here that apply to multiple users with one device, or even a single user with multiple devices, because sometimes people use micromobility even to hold and direct their own attention.
How users hold and manipulate physical documents suggests a natural vocabulary for interacting with digital documents with device micromobility. That is, the way people employ subtle orientation and repositioning of artifact to help steer the focus of attention in a joint activity. Micromobility also allows us to detect and accommodate social nuances in a natural and fluid manner. Collaborators often pass tablets in face-to-face interactions. Our face-to-face handoff technique switches to a guest profile when a user passes the tablet in this manner. We have demonstrated a number of techniques that combine fine-grained tablet grasp sensing with the micromobility of the device. Overall, these techniques demonstrate and contribute a unique interplay between user grasp, device movement, and orientation during both individual and collaborative activities.
All right, and I want to reemphasize there that all the sensing is just these few simple things in the tablet. There's no sort of global tracking system in the room like was shown in Saul and Nick's systems. So here's another example, because these same ideas could apply to tablet, but there's more varieties of use in these contexts. Because tablets afford frequent transitions between stationary and mobile use. Indeed, if you look closely, again, at this sort of seen but unnoticed way that people hold their devices, there's a whole zoo of postures here. And so to support the full richness of micromobility, we're going to need to properly transition in between these fine-grained contexts of use. It also sort of takes some of the sensing things we started to explore with Dongwook's project and kind of updates them to more modern sensors that I think are more practical and hopefully deployable in the not too distant future. Okay, so in this one, we're using 3 particular modalities, and 2 of them are already built into the screen. So one is the touchscreen itself, but now we can actually access the full heat map, the full raw image of the touchscreen. Of course, we also use the standard tilt and accelerometer information for the device, because I always do that. And finally, the interesting bit here is there's a custom peripheral electrical field sensor, which gives us grip plus the proximity of the hand and forearm to the screen bezel, even when it's not actually touching it, out to about, say, 5 centimeters or so. But it's just a capacitance sensor that plausibly could be built into the device chassis. All right, so here's a little demonstration of this.
When you grasp the tablet, grip-centric thumb tools appear. If the grip changes, the thumb tools follow. Sometimes it's unclear where to best put the tools. Just tilt to tip them one way or the other. Putting the tablet down, flat, returns the tools to a more standard device-centric palette. When you settle down to write or sketch, hand-centric palm tools appear. These miniature tools are easy to reach with the pen and let you stay focused on the work at hand. The fan tools appear when you hold 2 fingers. So on the desktop, you can work with both hands. When you let go, the fan tools disappear. But when you work with one hand, the fan tools stay posted. Posture awareness lets us gracefully degrade the interaction to suit mobile use. Even the pen can act as a tangible prop. Placing it on the screen reveals all of its hidden properties and options for the pen tip, the pen button, and the eraser. You can even use the pen as a container for photos or whole applications. Overall, we have seen how posture awareness can adapt interaction and morph user interface elements to suit the fine-grained context of use. This includes grip, the angle of the tablet, which hand the user employs, and other nuances of touch, including tangible props, but in a tablet-savvy way suitable for mobile use.
All right, so that gives you a sense of sort of all these very fine-grained contexts we can detect, even just a single use of a tablet. I wanted to harken back to one sort of older example that goes even further, this idea of instead of sensing more, actually sensing much less. And it also shows how we can still inform our design with proxemics and other aspects of social theory. This was work that was done by Gonzalo Ramos, who's here at MSR now, back when he was an intern with me in 2003, I think. But it's still very relevant because it also, as you see in the video, it dates from this era when displays didn't even have pen and touch yet. So it's from a few years back, but I think still quite interesting. And here, the only sensor is the pen itself. So we can see, or also it could work with touch gestures as well. And these modalities have this sort of one superpower, which is that compared to a mouse, they're not bound by the screen. They can actually span multiple displays as you move back and forth. And so there's no other sensor here but the pen itself. So let me...
Stitching contributes a new way for users to share information and to forge dynamic connections between distributed wireless devices by using pen gestures that span multiple displays. By selecting a photo and making a continuous pen gesture onto the other screen, the pen stroke itself specifies the two machines. Note that the graphical feedback appears to span the bezel between the displays, even if we arrange the tablets differently. As another example, if I want to give a presentation of selected photos to another user, I can select an image to start with, stitch the other screen, and choose Gallery from the menu. The other computer then displays a full screen view of those images I select on the first tablet. Users can employ the transporter to give photos to another user, even if that user is no longer nearby. The user drags a photo to the edge of the screen and dwells with the pen. After a brief pause, the photo is transported to the other device. We can support the technique on tablet PCs, as well as other devices such as the Pocket PC. Our stitching technique supports pen gestures between screens in any of these orientations.
All right, the one other detail I forgot to mention there is that the way the system knows which other devices to synchronize with is just through wireless signal strength. So it kind of has a sense of which devices are proximal in a very coarse-grained manner. All right, so I wanted to just show one more thing very quickly. And it's sort of a plug for an ongoing effort where we're trying to revisit all these issues and take them a bit further. And it's a project that we're calling Surface Fleet. And it tries to bring some of these concepts into a toolkit and example applications of device ecologies for what we call a society of devices experience. So at this stage, this is sort of still an ongoing effort. So we're still at kind of this stage where it's like, we think there's something interesting here. We haven't quite figured out what it is yet. But we think it'll be fun. And hopefully we'll have paper at upcoming CHI or WISC conferences. In particular, the Surface Fleet Toolkit builds on top of a system called Ambrosia, which is done by Jonathan Goldstein here at Microsoft Research. And it provides robustness to failure through performant database abstractions. And Ambrosia is already available as a fully open sourced toolkit on GitHub. And you can download and play with it now if you like. However, we're adding layers that run, communicate, and synchronize application state and all the kind of sensor events that we like to play with across multiple devices. So here's kind of our dream team working on some compelling applications and showing interesting ways they might use micromobility. I guess maybe it's the album cover for a new techno band too. I don't know. But since all Surface Fleet applications are inherently distributed, it naturally encourages one to re-envision cross-device activities and ecosystems. But we shall see. So perhaps this can let us take notions like distributed micromobility in the next level in a really practical manner. All right, so to conclude, as Saul advocated so well, we need to draw insights and inspiration from social science theory. But practical approaches that can work outside the lab will need to combine interaction designs that leave users in control rather than trying to infer everything, with nuanced but incomplete sensing, amenable to mass-produced devices. My hope is this perspective can spark fresh ideas for practical ecologies of devices. And of course, we'd love your insights. Perhaps all we're missing is an epiphany or two and a little bit more imagination. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have time for perhaps one question before the end. Come on, people. No, let's defer to the end. Thank you, Ken.
Thank you.
All right, I have the pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Caroline Appert from University of Paris Sud, in France. So she flew all the way here to talk to you guys. So Caroline is a research scientist, and she's been working a lot with innovative interaction techniques, whether on desktop, on tablets, with gestures, and then more recently, tangible interaction. Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you, Nathalie. So I'm very happy to be here. I don't see my notes. My notes are not showing up. So I'm the only one taking risks using this sophisticated setup, but I don't have them. Yes, I know. Yeah, that's okay now. So yes, so you can see that I rely on my presenter notes. It's not a secret. So in this talk, I will take inspiration from projects I have been working on to discuss how we can lower the cost for transitioning from one device to another. So let's start from a concrete example. So I'm working on my presentation for the Microsoft Faculty Summit on my laptop, the interface on the left, and I want to continue on my way to the office in the public transportation. So I want to move my work environment from my laptop to my smartphone, the interface on the right. However, it's not as simple as I want it to be. So first, I have to explicitly save my presentation in my drive from my laptop after having signed in the cloud. Once my presentation is in the cloud, then I can access it from my smartphone. But I am not done yet, and I still have a significant number of interaction steps to complete. I have to launch PowerPoint on my smartphone, then navigate files in my drive from there, after having made sure that I am signed in. And still, I'm not done yet. I have to navigate in my presentation to get to the slide I was actually working on my laptop. So here we have an illustration of the first problem, the number of interaction steps for transitioning from one device to another. And it's not the only problem. So it's quite often that the difference in screen sizes make the UI look different on two different devices. So for example, once on my smartphone, I don't know anymore what I should do to adjust the font size. So while I knew where this control was on my laptop, I have no idea where it is now on my smartphone. So in the end, while the cloud makes it possible to access data independently from the device I am working on, interaction remains very dependent on the device. So in the rest of this talk, I will point at three potentially interesting directions to lower the cost when transitioning from one device to another. So I will talk about tangibles, augmented reality, and gestures. So I start with tangibles. So in tangible interfaces, some physical objects can be used to interact with the digital world. The literature on tangibles for interaction mentions many interesting roles tangibles can play. They can serve as controllers, data containers, filters. They can also act as user identifiers in collaborative context, and so on. Tangibles are usually small, meaning that they are easy to transport, and they are simple. So they usually support a limited number of manipulations that require no or little training. But the problem with tangible interfaces is that they are often difficult to implement, or they require clumsy equipment in order to make tangible objects able to communicate with the digital system. So it's usually done either by putting cameras in the environment and implementing vision-based algorithms, or by embedding some electronics in both the tangibles and the system to make them able to communicate. But in our touch token project, we have shown that tangible interfaces can be not so costly to implement. So this is what we can see on this video, where the designer simply downloads a vector description of the token set and then uses it to laser cut or 3D prints simple tokens. And then they finally download the libraries that can recognize those tokens, and developers can implement applications using the simple API that we provide. So the principle, so why is it so quick to build tangible interfaces with touch tokens, is that because the principle is it's actually quite simple. So as you can, maybe you have noticed that tokens feature notches that indicate how to grasp them. And each token features a different configuration of notches. So then, when a token is held on a tactile surface, we can recognize a touch pattern that is representative of the token. So this simple solution makes touch tokens work on any tactile surface, on my trackpad, my smartphone, on a tabletop. And this also means that touch tokens can be made of any non-conductive material. So let's go through a series of simple demos to show the kind of things we can do with tangible interactions. So here, for example, we use colored acrylic tokens to control a scatter plot visualization. Oh, the sound. Can we put the sound off? Sorry. So here you can see touch tokens made of transparent acrylic that act as physical magic lenses. So as there is no need to embed electronics in touch tokens, they can be fully transparent, which is interesting here, because one token is associated with one map layer. So I can see the corresponding map layer through the token. Would it be possible to turn the sound off for the next, then there's a video. So we also developed a demo where we use tokens to control access to some applications. So here, in this video, some application icons are disabled. So these applications can't be launched with a simple touch. Users actually need the corresponding token to launch the application. So with such a simple interaction, I can control access to some stuff on my tablet. I can lend my tablet to my kids and keep the token for my emails, for example, for the email application. And finally here, we have a simple game application where users, so typically kids here, have to dock physical tokens into their silhouette that is displayed on the screen. So getting back to our transition problem. So we had, if you remember, we had to sign in twice, once on each device, save data in the cloud, launch the application, navigate to the slide we were working on. And well, I was thinking when preparing this slide, we could use a token and to have just a single interaction steps to actually move my work environment from one device to another. So I just put the token, for example, on my laptop's trackpad to capture my current work context. And then I put this same token on my smartphone to get this context restored. So this idea is based on the series of demos that we have just seen, where tokens can be used to control access, thus signing in a transparent way, and then can be associated with data and commands. So here the token would be associated with the presentation file, the application name, and the application state to restore the complete work environment. And I could use this same token to move to any other available device, because touch tokens can work on any tactile surface. So for example, I can also move on my tablet or even on the wall-size screen that is available in my lab. So moving to another advantage of the tokens, something that I didn't mention is that tangible objects are very interesting because they provide haptic feedback when we manipulate them. So this property can be interesting to make several devices work together, where one device is used to remote control of another device. So let's take the concrete example of Office Remote, where users can control their PowerPoint slide deck that runs on one distant screen from a simple UI displayed on their smartphone. Actually, here I have a tangible interface, but you could have an app on your smartphone. But if the presenter wants to keep her attention on the audience and not look at the smartphone, she's typically limited to very simple gestures that basically support next and previous slides only, because otherwise more complex gestures or precise button would require me to look precisely to the smartphone. And using tokens would make it possible to get much more elaborate controls that would remain operable eyes-free. So for example, tokens could make her able to control a video player or even do some data storytelling. So she could manipulate a token, for example, putting it, squeezing it, rotating it, to interactively filter information or emphasize interesting parts in the infographics for a more engaging presentation. So more controlled, eyes-free. Well, okay, so we've talked about tangible interactions. They are cool, but they can represent quite a big move for a company like Microsoft. But if we think about it, actually some Microsoft devices are accompanied by a tangible object, which is the pen. But the typical interaction paradigm with a pen is one pen writes on one device only. So if we draw a parallel with what we have seen with tangible interfaces, it's quite different from the idea of having several tokens that can play many roles in the interaction. So for example, we can wonder whether having multiple pens in some context, for example in the office, could be a good thing. Instead of playing with small UI components to change one pen's drawing style, we could switch between several physical specific pens. Another thing, we have seen that using tokens across devices can be interesting. So we can think that the same would stand with pens. But as for today, one pen is paired with a unique device, thus making it impossible to perform some cross-device interactions. So this might be good to reconsider. But from what I've seen when I was preparing this talk, it seems that the new Microsoft Surface Pen will work on several surfaces, so that's good. And a final thing that we can point at is that a pen usually writes, which makes perfect sense. But at the same time, there is no major reason to limit pen's function to writing. For example, they could be used for transferring data, and why not for signing in on my device? So let's now move to the next part of my talk. How can augmented reality help lower the cost when transitioning from one device to another? So getting back to our initial problem again, so I mentioned that a UI can look quite different on two different devices. So for example, I know how to change the font size on PowerPoint on my desktop, but I don't know how to do it on my smartphone. Oops. OK. So what I might be interested here is to get some support to show me the mapping between the interface I am familiar with, the desktop one, and the interface I am new to, the smartphone one. This is where augmented reality could play a role. For example, here I hold my smartphone. I don't know where the font size control is on my smartphone. So thanks to AR glasses, I could have both interfaces displayed in the same place. So AR shows me the desktop UI I am familiar with, and I can then point at one familiar UI component, here the font size. I don't know if you notice the small cursor move. And AR shows me where to find it, this same control on my smartphone. Here, an arrow shows me the button with 3 dots. I tap on it. And AR now circles where the UI component for adjusting the font size is. So the idea of mapping two interfaces by means of augmented reality is not a specific scenario I have actually worked on. However, it is such uses of AR that motivate the need for an efficient way of interacting with 2D virtual objects displayed in a headset screen. But the thing is that for now, such interactions are quite difficult. So even simply pointing at an object is not so easy. So it usually relies on gaze, which is quite fast, but with some drawbacks. So it's prone to accidental activations, and it makes the viewport move, so which causes some objects leave the field of view. So an alternative could consist in using direct pointing with hands in front of the headset, but it causes fatigue very quickly. So what we are currently looking at is whether indirect pointing can work in augmented reality. So with indirect pointing, users make movements in a virtual plane, which is not collocated with that of the screen, and movements control a cursor, which is displayed in the headset screens. So it's typically what we do on a laptop when we move our fingers on the trackpad to make the cursor move on the screen. The trackpad and the screen are not collocated. So we are currently running a study to identify where and how to position this mid-air imaginary trackpad relative to the user's body. So the idea is to put it in a position that both ensures comfortable movements and efficiency in pointing. So we consider the waist, the waist, the wrist, and the thigh. And we also look at the orientation of such a mid-air trackpad should be. So parallel to the screen or not. So why do we do that? If we think about a desktop trackpad, the trackpad's plane is not parallel to that of the screen. And we want to see whether such a difference in relative orientation also works in augmented reality. So for the last part of my talk, I will quickly discuss the use of gestures across devices. So we have seen that visual consistency between the same application on two devices can be a problem. So one way of getting rid of some visual UI components is to rely on gestures for activating commands. But the problem with gestures is that the number of simple gestures is limited. Plus, one gesture can be appropriate for one device and quite uncomfortable on another device. So just to take a simple example, the usual pinch and rotate gestures is much more uncomfortable to perform on a vertical surfaces than it is on a horizontal surface. So one solution consists in allowing several variations of a gesture to activate the same command, so users can choose the variations they judge the most comfortable for the device they are interacting with. So this is what we have done in this project, where gesture recognition is based on some gesture properties as opposed to be on their actual shape. So for example, we consider whether a gesture is anchored or not, which means that it features at least one idle point during its execution or not. Another property is whether a gesture follows a linear trajectory or a circular one. And the last example of such a property is whether a gesture features a point within its envelope that remains invariant during its execution, kind of reference point. So by recognizing some properties as opposed to the exact gestures, it makes it possible for users to perform different variations of the same gesture. So for example, these two gestures that you can see on the bottom right, so they are the same, they activate the same command, but one is more appropriate for a small handheld screen like a tablet, while the other is more appropriate for a large vertical screen like a Surface Hub. And in this project, we also paid a particular attention at designing gestures that can be recognized in real time, as opposed to many research projects that propose gestures that are recognized a posteriori, which means once users have finished them. So here, the gesture properties that we consider are local ones. This means that they can be recognized in real time. So gestures can not only be used for continuous control, like a pinch gesture is used to continuously adjust the zoom factor, but it also means that users can fluidly transition from one gesture to another. So this makes it possible to chain commands, such as set the typeface and the font size, or such as resizing an object and rotating it in the same interaction. So here we can see 3 small videos of 3 possible types of such transitions. So they are very short videos that shows I'm doing 2 different gestures without removing my hands from the tablet. And that's it for me. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Caroline. We have time for one question for Caroline before we move on to the panel. Anyone question? Nope. All right, so let's get all of our speakers back on stage, please. Thank you. So we have now time for sort of a more, relaxed conversation. Maybe with seeded by question from the audience or bigger question for the whole set of perspective that we had today on that topic. Is there a couple of people wanted to see the question or two?
Hello, my name is Parbo Tamogan. I'm from Washington State University. And my question is, I was just watching that room that you had the test run of the 3 men that were just kind of moving things in proximity and how that was related. Is that now, or was that maybe a couple years ago, or is that where you guys currently are right now?
Are you talking about the F formation?
Yeah, the F formation, the room where, I don't really know how to describe it well.
You guys.
Yeah, there were a few studies done, but the image I showed, at least, of showing sort of the micromobility and how people lift tablets, that was from a study that Nick and I did in 2011, I think. And there we actually just use foam core display boards as proxies for physical tablets, because we didn't really want to focus so much on the weight and form factor. And it was a totally, I mean, that was not a staged shot that I had in my talk. It was totally just naturalistic things that just occurred, and we sort of captured in a video and just pulled out some of the keyframes there just to show what happens. So these are kind of very deeply baked behaviors, I think. They probably do change somewhat with, over time. People like, I mean, for example, I can remember when the, sort of the Bluetooth headsets first came out and people would be talking to themselves like as they're going down the street. Like, I found that really weird, but I'm also getting kind of old at this point, right? So I think people do adapt culturally over time. But I think these sort of implicit behaviors, just showing things to people, how close we are, these are sort of, across all cultures, like the exact rules vary. But the distance always matters. The exact threshold might be different for cultures, but distance always matters. How you hold things always matters. So I think they're universal things. But it would be nice to kind of revisit that with modern devices that are getting lighter, thinner, different sizes, different form factors emerging, and see what kind of new sort of proxemic or micromobility behaviors might be emerging currently as well.
Hi, Fanny Chevalier from University of Toronto. Thank you so very much for all of those fantastic talks. I was a bit distracted with some emails here and there, but I saw like many great, fantastic ideas out there. So these ideas are still a bit disconnected for me. And actually, I have troubles because I'm not working in this space, like seeing the big picture or like where we're headed to. So I was curious to know if you had to work all four of you together and write a paper that is what are the next challenges, the big challenges for cross-device interaction. What would, and I would love to see this paper coming, actually. So what would be those like a big challenges, most pressing challenges, or like big interesting opportunities?
Well, I can start that a little bit. First, many of us have actually worked together over the years. Nick and Ken and I have done a lot of work together, and that's why you saw so many of the slides on the same in our presentations. I think I think there's a lot of big challenges. Like, one of the things that really concerns me is that we're trying to build on social practices, which is a really good thing. It means that people just get it, they understand it, they know what to do. Given a proper feedback, they just understand what's happening. The concern for me is that can be played as well. By played, I mean that it's that whole dark pattern side of things, where can somebody spoof these systems? Can somebody actually access information on your device or push information on it when you don't want it? And there's some of the mechanisms here kind of showed how you can start safeguarding about it. But part of that is how do you build federations of devices? And I think the F-formations work was one of that, was how do you decide what devices are joined together and which ones are outside it, or what actions will trigger that. So for example, the stitching that Ken showed, where you essentially have to have a continuity of an action across the device, which is very visible to all the participants, can help that as well. The sensing aspect, how do you actually sense information without it being in the cloud so you know that everything is local? I'm really concerned about that because maybe it's just me getting older, but I see a lot of technology design where we think, here's all the great stuff we can do, but without thought into here's the bad stuff. So that was sort of rambling, but in essence, there's lots of big challenges: the sensing, the safeguarding, the fluidity, understanding social norms, making sure that people get it, putting that into standard practice. All that is part of the challenges. And I'm sure these guys and girls have some other things too.
That's a great summary. There's the article already.
Yeah.
So. But one thing that I also thought about when you asked about the big challenges, I think a particular bit that I showed you earlier with interaction techniques we tried to map out is that it sometimes felt like it, and definitely my own work probably falls into that category, that we come up with a lot of interaction techniques that are often feel quite specialized, but then we argue they kind of generalize across it. So we're kind of in that mishmash in the middle somewhere, where I think future direction could be interesting to find out a few techniques which are generalized and become more part of a general vocabulary of techniques, at the one end of the spectrum, and at the other end of the spectrum, identifying those particular techniques that are very targeted at one particular use case or a very small particular use case, instead of staying too much in the middle. And I think that's something that could be quite interesting to do over the next few years.
Yeah, one thing that is also important in my opinion, is that you focused a lot on in your 3 talks in collaborative context where you have several devices for several users. But actually, as Natalie pointed out at the beginning, we have many configurations now where one people has many devices. And in that case, safeguarding is a different problem. It still is, because you don't want something, for example, with hands off. With Apple, if I put my smartphone close to my laptop, something might show up without actually that I clearly keep control on it on my screen, and I don't want others to to actually be behind my shoulder and see what was on my smartphone. But so I think also studying this problem of the constellation of devices for one user is something that we should push further. And my take would be also that something, an additional device like tangibles or small AR glasses can play a big role in that.
So I have 2 answers as well. The first one is that we have not written the paper challenges in cross-device interaction because it'd be a really long paper. The second is that another big challenge is that if you use some of these natural behaviors people have and you kind of overload them with technical meanings like oh, I lift up my phone and like suddenly Clippy pops up on my screen, right? That it actually co-opts using that for human-human communication, right? So that's sort of the other challenge is like how do you let people still interact naturally in the real world where I happen to be holding my phone and I'm talking to Saul, but I'm really not concerned with doing something there. So you have to somehow leave the user in control or have some sort of explicit gating mechanism where there's some intentionality to the interactions, or maybe a few can be sensed in the background in clever ways. But you don't want to sort of smash the natural human interaction because like we actually do still like to actually talk to people occasionally.
Do you have one more question?
Yeah,
there's one.
several.
Yeah,
So number 1.
Thank you. So Dan Angus from Queensland University of Technology. I've got a question around, I guess, what I see as a challenge for us in this space, which is that everybody brings different devices to the table, right? And these are owned by different proprietary corporations and interacting in different kind of media ecologies, which are, I guess, from where I sit, seem to be moving more towards a walled garden space, right? If we look at social media companies and their kind of appetite for controlling more and more of the space and more of our data, how do we move back against this, and how do we deal in an environment where a lot of gestures and interaction types are also patented or protected, and so we're restricted not just in the creative space but in actual implementation of what would be a really nice, say, naturalistic gesture? We can't actually do that because that would say, move up against a patent or something. How do we move forward in this space?
Okay.
Or can't we?
One who answered that.
Yeah. So that's really interesting. Like one of the other things I've been doing over the last few years has been working as an expert witness for IP in IP cases. And you're absolutely right. The things that people are suing each other on are insane, and they're the most smallest things you can imagine in a patent that they generalize to include everything in the world. I take heart that. If you go back to the Xerox Star back in, what year was that? That was, 83. Yeah, thanks, Bill. Bill was the only one of us who was young then. The rest of us weren't born. Sorry, Bill. One of the concepts, and this was mentioned before, was what are the universal commands that apply everywhere? And I think if you look back on that, I can't remember the exact ones, but the things that we now take for granted, like cut, copy, paste, point, those kind of things, they were all provided back then, and they were universally adopted by all the vendors. How do we make that happen today? I actually don't know in this day of protectionism, but perhaps the best way to make it happen is by having a lot of people start complaining about, hey, my Apple device doesn't talk to my Samsung device, which doesn't talk to my other device. At some point, maybe it'll be seen as a benefit to the various companies involved to say that, yes, we do, it is actually a beneficial and actually economic sense to actually support cross-device experiences.
So a strike.
Yes.
Right, yeah.
And
Hi, Devalina from University of Illinois, Chicago. So I really like the whole idea of cross-device experiences came from the social theory of proxemics or Hall, right? But when that theory came up, there was not a vis-a-vis formation with two people looking at their phones. What's happening right now? So my question is, now that you guys have worked on cross-device experiences for so long using the theory, what do you think about going back and updating or informing back to the social sciences? Is there anything that you have learned that we can go back and update or inform or change anything from the proxemics?
One quick answer I would have is that I searched around in some of those old social theories, and like other than micromobility, which actually came from the HCI and CSCW literature, there's actually not much discussion of that in the sociological literature that I've been able to find. Maybe I just don't know the right keyword, but it's also literature that's very hard to search online because it's mostly dates from the 1960s and it's hard to find things. But there's been very little study of how objects mediate these sort of formations. So kind of the example you stated where two people standing face to face, but maybe they're on their individual phones. So my sense, and I've sort of poked around with this in a couple of papers I've written, but haven't really formalized it, is that there is a notion of device proxemics that's somewhat connected to human body space proxemics, but exactly how holding a phone modulates my personal space is unclear and hasn't been studied that closely. So I think that would be a great topic for someone to tackle if they're interested or want to collaborate with us. But we haven't really done that study other than just showing a few examples like, hey, it looks like the way you hold this foam course tablet, like it affects the formation that people adopt, for example. So there's definitely things there, but what are the parameters of that? What theories drive that is still unknown, I'd say.
And it's interesting that you asked that because I actually asked Ken the same question, was it yesterday, where he said, hey, do you know any theories out there about what it actually means to actually exchange a piece of paper with someone else? In linguistics, they look at the breakdowns of language down to micro utterances, and yet again, maybe for the same reason, it could be out there. I don't know where it is. That I don't know if anybody's done any actual work on actual physical exchange and what happens with that. The whole give and take process, like the old thing of, here, take this, and he grabs it, but none of us are really going to let it go. I really don't want to give it to you, but you. So all those little funny things that happen in everyday life. But the good news is that we all know that stuff too. It's all tacit within us. So it's not, we sometimes can't articulate what it is, but we kind of know when it breaks. Mm-hmm.
Just to comment on the previous question, some of it, there are some basic rules, and it's simply what's visible, and that the moral order of place and the social mores are whether things are visible. And it's really interesting to see when you move things from a phone, like the photographs, the example, from a phone to a laptop or something back and forth. There's magic in the middle where it goes through this middle space where it's invisible. And if we look at the Surface table, the original Surface table that Steve Patish and Andy Wilson did, what was really important about that teaches us something is when you put two phones on the table and you're moving photographs between, the middle space was filled because it was visible, and you had this foreground. The table, which used to be the foreground device, became the background, and the foreground devices were the tangible things on top, and you saw the transition. And so as long as you have that awareness of what's going on, and so when it's not possible to have that background feedback, the question is, and in some of the examples you did that beautifully, it was clear that they were going because you had this continuity of momentum. And so that's where you don't switch. You have this analog flow. You establish the trajectory your eyes follow, even if it's invisible, and you see it arrive. And those types of feedback are the things where you preserve this knowledge of what went to have confirmation. And the examples showed that beautifully, but it's all too rare. And that's one of the most important lessons, I think, that came out of the video examples that you showed.
Okay, maybe the last question there. We have a few minutes left.
Lucy Fortson, University of Minnesota. Can you elaborate on the sensing technologies that will need to be developed in order for us to get to the point where we're not under a hub or something like that? You alluded to a few things, several of you in your talks, but I'm just sort of interested from the engineering or sensing side, what actually are the next steps that have to happen in order to make this ubiquitous?
I think if I had the answer, I would have put it in my talk. It's very tricky. I mean, a lot of the things that, like Saul and Nick in particular, did some great work exploring, like, what if you have all this richness about where people are standing, where devices are, you kind of know all the 6 degree of freedom orientation of the devices and people in the room and where they're looking. You can do some amazing stuff with that. It's unclear to me if there's a nice technical path in the near-term future, say the next 5 to 10 years, where we could actually get there in a way that you could put in an iPad and it would be everywhere. So that's a big challenge. But so part of it, I think, is having more, instead of outside-in tracking, where it's like it's in the environment, you have to be in the special place for it to work. If it's inside out, so maybe some of the things like, if you think of the HoloLens type of device, not as augmented reality, but just simply as a sensor that you walk around with, maybe that kind of hints at where, if that was just on a device and it's kind of looking out, that gives you a hint of, like, maybe that's how you could sense spatial relationships in a way that's scalable. But it also it still raises, privacy concerns, like, do people consent to being tracked when they're in the same? I mean, there's all kinds of, those kind of issues, I think, are really difficult, and I don't have the faintest clue how to attack them, to be perfectly frank.
One of the things, like as Ken mentioned, we started this whole approach thinking about what if we had almost perfect knowledge of what was going on, and what could we do to design very nuanced interfaces for cross-device interaction, and also for person-device interaction, which I didn't really show in the videos. I think starting from the other way is also really interesting. If we start by saying, here are the social norms we want to provide. How can we use existing technology on our devices? Like, we have a lot of sensors on our devices to actually follow some of those social norms. So can we use a camera on a device in a way that it actually recognizes the other devices and enables some kind of social norms? So starting from the minimal set could help give us insight into what we can do with that minimal set. And I think your work where you started talking about how can we just use some kind of pretty simple sensors to do that is a starting point. But if you're building toward the social norm, and that's what you're designing toward, I think you can actually get away with a lot by using very simple sensors that already exist on devices.
All right. With that, we're going to conclude it with food for thoughts and future challenges we need to tackle and get food in our belly. Thank you very much, everyone.
All right, thank you.